Chapter 29, the Fête Chmptr. There St. John mingles with my friendly bowl, the feast of reason and the flow of soul. Horace, Satire, Pope. A charming rural scene was displayed, a broad and level plateau extended over the river's banks and ornamented with magnificent trees interspersed with bowers and open glades. Along the greensward were hundreds of tents and pavilions decorated with banners and occupied by the invited guests. We entered the Duke's Maison de Chmptr, a beautiful chateau embowered with amid a grove. The ducal party had arrived a short time before. We retired to our apartments, and having made our toilettes for the festival, passed out to the lawn where the guests were assembled. The princess with her suite of beautiful young ladies were clad in rustic attire, as flower girls, nut and berry gatherers, dairymaids, and shepherdesses. Prince Altafora with his friends, as foresters, hunters, horsemen, farmer boys, and fishermen. The guests were attired in various rural or sylvan costumes. The dresses of some were composed of beautiful vegetable lace or gauze, of exceeding delicate texture, and a variety of various colors. Some wore girdles, necklaces, bracelets of delicate moss, leaves, capsules, seeds, scarves, and mantles woven from the fine tendrils of plants and grasses. The attire of the ladies presented a fairy-like and beautiful appearance. The guests, numbering over 2,000 persons, comprised the highest dignitaries of the realm and included the most distinguished representatives of the three Martian races, the Arungas, Rohitas, and Nilatas, belonging to the various kingdoms in friendly relations with the kingdom of Mandal Ultima. We passed through a long colonnade of trees whose foliage formed a complete canopy overhead, and entered a great circular amphitheater floored with green and red moss, and screened with silken awnings supported on rustic pillars of wood. We were greeted by a concert of feathered songsters. Hundreds of birds of various species unknown on earth, assembled on a high platform under the trees, sang a grand triumphal march. The melody was borne by bands of white and gray-colored birds in tones of wonderful sweetness and power. The voices of some were like those of our nightingales, skylarks, and thrushes. Others resembled the tones of various orchestral instruments, violins, flutes, clarinets, etc. Others like cornets and French horns. The bass parts were sustained by large gray-colored birds resembling our loons and wild geese in deep and powerful tones like double bass or trombones. Some held drumsticks to their claws, beating drums. Others struck triangles and cymbals. In front stood the leader, a tall brown-colored bird resembling a stork, standing on one leg, waving a long white baton in his claw. They kept as good a time, and phrasing and modulation was like that of a well-trained orchestra of human musicians. It certainly was the most wonderful performance of its kind ever witnessed by a denizen of Earth or any other planet. "These birds," said the doctor, "have been cultivated and trained in music for many generations, until their organs and abilities have attained the highest state of development." The Duke now took my hand and drew me forward in full view of the guests. "Dear friends," he said, "I take pleasure in presenting to you our esteemed guest, Lieutenant Hamilton, an officer of the Navy of the United States of America. He is the first inhabitant of Earth who has ever visited our world. I pray you extend to him all the kind consideration and courtesy which he, as a representative of the younger Earth-born race, is entitled to receive." I sustained the battery of 2,000 pair of eyes as best as I might. The assembled throngs greeted me in the Martian style. John and the Raven were introduced by the doctor and prince. The Tanihoka war chief and Commodore Jack received the salutations with stately dignity, bowing to the right and left in a style worthy of Beau Brummel in his palmy days. 5 long tables radiated from an elevated dais, enabled the royal party and guests to view each other with ease. The maitre de cérémonies having arranged the guests in order according to their respective ranks, we sat down and the banquet began. Flocks of little amber-colored hued birds flew down from the trees, bearing in their beaks fragrant bouquets and large white leaves on which were imprinted the menu, distributing them among the guests, while bands of young boys, attired as Ganymedes, attended to the courses. The service was entirely rustic. The plates, dishes, centerpieces, etc., were composed of bark, vines, and tendrils closely interwoven. The cups, goblets, and flagons composed of leaves, corollas, and calyxes. The knives, forks, and spoons of wood, variously carved and ornamented. Every single article of the service was composed of vegetable materials, and in all manners of unique and pretty designs. As to the viands, had bounteous nature, as she displays her prodigious resources to us Trustians, been called of her choicest products, she could never have furnished half the delicacies and novelties here displayed. The dies vestae and apiculae and the cani lassituses and the convivium sibicantum of the emperors and nobles in the days of the old Rome's luxurious splendors, les petites soupers of the old French monarchy, all sink into utter insignificance in comparison with the festival feasts of the Martians. Among the most infinite variety of viands, I recognized a few of Earth's productions, but none of the usual standbys of rounds of beef, legs of mutton, haunches of venison, dressed ham, fowl, game, lobster, terrapin, etc., etc., so essential to our terrestrial banquets, were visible. You missed your roast beef, etc., etc., doubtless, remarked the doctor. Remembering that the last bite of meat I tasted was on board my ship, I frankly confessed that I did, and inquired as if inhabitants of Mars were vegetarians. The pure Martians, who have kept their races distinct from admixture with others, live exclusively on that diet. Many of the mixed races and nations occupying our southern hemisphere consume meats of all kinds, and the pernicious effects are manifested among them, replied he. I now informed the doctor that, in the opinion of our terrestrial physiologists, an exclusively vegetable diet tends to weaken the system by not affording sufficient nourishment to the tissues, that nearly all the civilized and enlightened nations of the earth lived on a mixed diet, consuming different varieties of meat, that the races and individuals who subsisted exclusively on a vegetable diet were inferior in bodily strength and mental vigor, were almost universally timid and slavish, and that our wild races, who subsisted almost entirely on meat or game, were superior in physical strength and courage to the vegetable-eating tribes. And they probably are correspondingly superior in evil passions, tyrannous dispositions, cruelty and brutality, not to speak of all kinds of constitutional taints, inflammations, and other bodily and mental diseases. Is that not so? I was fain to acknowledge that, in respect to many of the meat-eating inhabitants of Earth, this statement was not far from the truth. The same physiological law is manifest in the whole animal kingdom, said the doctor. Contrast the superior strength, beauty of form, and docility of disposition of the herbivore animals adapted for the use of man with the whole carnivorous tribes, their ferocity, treachery, and utter destitution of kindly instincts, not to speak of the reptiles. Look at the whole ornithological kingdom, where you will find a single specimen of the carnivorous class of birds that take kindly to man or are susceptible to being tamed except by coercion, or can utter a single musical note. Listen to the nightingale, thrush, linnet, robin, and the whole class of singing birds whose diet is purely vegetable, and contrast their beautiful tones with the harsh cries and discordant screams of the whole tribes of hawks, vultures, ospreys, cormorants, owls, etc. I was compelled to acknowledge the truth of the doctor's observation. Animal food has the inherent tendency to repress the development of the higher and nobler attributes of man, the moral sentiments and feelings, and it has worse effect also of stimulating and fostering the instincts and passions of our lower nature. You terrestrians, in spite of your advancement in civilization, wealth, power, and progress in science, will always have more or less discord, turmoil, and warfare among your nations, societies, and individuals, not to speak of poverty, vice, and crime, as long as you devour meat. It will take several generations of total abstinence before you can disevolve your constitutional carnivorous inclinations. You may then hope to have peace and unity among your nations, and physical, mental, and moral health and happiness among your societies and individuals. Although this was hardly to be expected, that I could entirely subscribe to the doctor's view, being by birth and lineage a terrestrial meat-eater, still I felt compelled to acknowledge that his statement embodied a greater physiological truth, which was to be hoped terrestrians might in time be prepared to accept practically. "Look around the board," said he. "Observe our guests. How do their physical appearances, forms, facial expressions, etc., compare with those of your flesh-eating nations and races?" I was compelled to acknowledge that, while in respect to mere stature and bulk of frame, the Martian men were rather below the terrestrial standards, yet in respect to exuberant health, pure blood, buoyant spirits, beauty and symmetry of form, and intellectuality of expression, they were fully equal to, and in many instances superior to, the finest specimens of physical manhood seen among the enlightened and cultivated races of Earth. And with respect to our Martian ladies also, please give us your opinion, and do not permit it to be influenced by any sentiment of gallantry which gentlemen generally entertain towards the fairer sex. "I will endeavor to do so," I replied, "and view them simply from a physiological point of view. I frankly acknowledge that, as regards beauty and symmetry of form and feature, as well as the higher charms of grace and expression, the Martian ladies are unsurpassed by the most highly favored of womankind among the inhabitants of Earth, and what is still more remarkable, they seem to combine the more pleasing characteristics of our different nationalities, to wit, the amiability and gentleness of the Anglo-Saxon, the modesty and ingenuousness of the German, the voluptuousness of the Circassian, and the fire and dash of the Greek, the mingled gravity and sweetness of the Spanish, the langueur and delicioso of the Italian, and the esprit and vivacity of the French, and the high spirit, independence, and refinement of the American. A thousand thanks for your admirably expressed compliment, and I will now inform you that not a single particle of meat of any kind has ever passed the lips of our guests, nor those of our ancestors for remotest generations. We thoroughly detest meat, as you would the reptilian and insect food of the lowest savages. Our blood is pure and untainted from the flesh of any living creature. Not a single life that God has given has ever yet been taken. Not a single drop of blood that he has warmed has ever been shed. Not a single frame that he has cunningly fashioned ever been yet spread, a mutilated carcass, on our table, nor rolled as a sweet morsel under our tongues. And what I say of our guests here is the same is true of 3,000 million Martians. A magnificent orchestra concealed amongst the trees discoursed charming and appropriate music at intervals during the feast. The appointment of the cuisine were the acme of perfection. The gamaids sped swiftly over the sward, bringing on and removing the courses. Flocks of birds fluttered around, bearing in their beaks clusters of pods and capsules containing pleasant aromatic juices, oils, and spices, with which we flavored our viands. The flower-bearing birds removed the bouquets already distributed, bringing new ones. Beautiful little hummingbirds hovered over the young girls with buds, sprigs, and sprays in their tiny beaks, fixing them in their hair or to their bosoms, their swiftly fluttering wings resembling aureolae of rainbow colors. It were impossible to describe the dessert. The variety of delicacies was almost infinite. It seemed as if the gardens of the Hesperides and Elysian fields had been culled of their most luscious sweets and confections, and it is to be hoped that the juvenile darlings of Earth, hearing this tempting gustatory allusion, will not all clamor to be carried to Mars in 20 million mile per minute ethervolt car next Thanksgiving or Christmas. The feast drew near its close, and the time for toasts was at hand. A company of tall birds with long necks and bills resembling storks, cranes, gossamers, and flamingos marched in line, bearing floral flagons, decanters, and queer-looking bottles containing sparkling liquors, and set them before us. They were all varieties of flavor and shade. the usual sentiments were offered with the appropriate responses. The health and prosperity of the nations of earth, and particularly the United States of America, were drunk by the Duke, the Prince, and other dignitaries, to which I responded in as good terms as I could command. The Martians are brimful of wit, humor, and vivacity, all which are rendered the more piquant and agreeable by their high-bred courtesy and refinement. "What think you of our liquors?" the doctor asked. "The finest brands I ever tasted. The most Epicurean terrestrial would go in ecstasies over them. Nothing comparable is produced amongst the vineyards of earth. I fear, however, we shall soon become more than merry over our generous libations." "Have no fear. Our flowing flagons cheer, but do not inebriate." "Do you mean to say we are not drinking wine?" "They are the unfermented juices of rare plants distilled and rectified in the laboratory of nature, and do not contain a single drop of alcohol. They possess exceedingly delicate and peculiar properties, which have a very kindly influence on the system. They relieve bodily fatigue and increase physical and mental vigor. They produce peculiar effects upon the different mental facilities, and the association of ideas is facilitated, the memory is sharpened, the judgment formed with greater ease and accuracy, language becomes more fluent and exact, imagination and fancy are stimulated to the highest degree, as manifested in the department of poetry, music, etc. Look around the board and witness the influence of these liquors already. There is a company of logicians elucidating some profound metaphysical problems. There is a coterie of statesmen adjusting some intricate question on international and state policy. See those eminent members of the bar? They have had a knotty legal problem before them for weeks. They'll solve it before they rise from the table. There is one of our most distinguished mathematicians clearing up an intricate calculation in fluxions. There is one of our great orators holding his listeners spellbound with a brilliant forensic display. Yonder is one of our poets entrancing his hearers with a fine extemporaneous effusion. And one of our renowned musical composers is jotting down on his tablets the theme of some new oratorio, symphony, or concerto. Several young ladies and gentlemen entertained the guests with dramatic recitals and songs, which were received with applause. "Come, Lieutenant," said the Prince, "please favor us with one of your terrestrial songs." "Your Highness will please excuse me. I am no singer," I replied. "No singer? Pardon me, Lieutenant. I have not forgotten your magnificent singing on the polar seas of your world, and I sincerely hope you will not refuse my friends this pleasure." "A song from so distinguished a representative from our brother planet would greatly add to our festivities," said the Duke. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the doctor, rising, "our esteemed guest, Lieutenant Hamilton, will favor us with a song in his native language." "A song! A song!" ran around the board with a loud clapping of hands. Feeling considerably abashed at the idea of posing in the role of societal warbler before this brilliant assembly, I was tempted to resort to the usual interposition subterfuges so frequently affected by petted musical amateurs in our fashionable circles, and which are more often betrayals of vanity than otherwise, when a bright smile and winsome glance from the Princess inspired me with courage. I arose without more ado and dashed off into Tom Moore's famous drinking song. "Fill the bumper fair, every drop we sprinkle, over the brow of care, smooths away a wrinkle. With electric's fame never so swiftly passes, and when through the frame it shoots from brimming glasses." Immense applause rewarded my efforts, and the audience insisted upon favoring them with others of still more convivial character, and the encores were vociferous. Several distinguished poets and musicians solicited the translations. I had previously quoted a few of the more grand and beautiful extracts from Shakespeare, Byron, Scott, Poe, Longfellow, etc. to my Martian friends, and took pleasure in adding the sweet bard of Erin and one of our well-known American songwriters to the list. It was with feelings of great pride I reflected that I had been the humble instrument of introducing Earth's mighty bards to the world of Mars. And now came an ornithological opera comique. The feathered songsters were dressed out in all varieties of stage costumes and arranged on the platform. There were kings and queens, princesses, belles and beaux, clowns, brigands, horned devils, and imps. Other birds, clad in fashionable attire, were assembled around as audience. The feathered songsters warbled, chirruped, and trilled in a style that would have done credit to the high-class Italian opera, while the audience expressed their approval or disapproval, clapping their wings, piping out their little bravos and encores, or hissing and mewing catcalls after the style of the high-toned Parisian audiences. The performance was so irresistibly comical as provoked shouts of laughter from the guests. 4 beautiful snow-white doves now appeared bearing in their beaks a veil of light gossamer, throwing off soft prismatic colors, then placing it over the brow of the princess, its falling folds enveloped her form like a halo. They were followed by flocks of birds, scattering oak leaves over the guests. This announced the close of the feast, and the guests rose from their table. The princess, accompanied by her suite of maidens, passed around among them, distributing to each a little gold plate containing a salt cake, as a hansel or token of friendship and a memento of the festival. And now came the finale. Hundreds of little children attired as fairies, sylphs, elfins, pixies, brownies, and all imaginable myths of Martian fairy land and folklore rushed from the woods and bowers, accompanied by all the feathered songsters and stage actors, assembling around the tables with loud shouts and merry peals of laughter. They were waited on by the gamamedes, bouquet and fruit-bearing birds, the storks and flamingos. The songsters, perched around or flitting over the dishes, selected the choicest delicacies, drinking from the flower cups, standing on one leg and wiping their beaks with their little napkins, while the hummingbirds flitted in flocks over the tables, picking the tidbits amid a perfect babel of twittering, pipings, and chirruping. The Commodore, inspired by the festive scene, marched with stately step to the highest place on the royal dais, glanced over the assembled throngs as if he were the king of the feast, then, with the serenity of a superfine, fashionable gourmand, deliberately appropriated the courses in regular order as they were obsequiously presented by the storks and gamamedes, politely declining, however, any such sentimental nonsense as buttonhole bouquets, cakes, and confectionery, but bestowing critical attention to the sparkling potations in the globes and bottles. This concluded, he wiped his beak, bowed in stately style to the fairy guests, descended from the dais, and mounted his accustomed station on his master's shoulder. In the meantime, the guests had assembled in the pavilion on the glade. A deputation from the Neapolis now appeared with an invitation for the ducal party to visit their own festival held on the opposite side of the lake in honor of the birthday of Princess Luzelda, daughter of Onega Zangora Amdolian, Grand Prince regnant of Rajvolhandra, the kingdom of the Nialatas, corresponding to Madler's continent on our maps of Mars, situated on the eastern hemisphere and separated from Galileo's continent by the great Tycho Sea. This powerful nation of the blue complexion race, numbering 600 million inhabitants, was in close relation of amity with the kingdom of the Mandala Ultima, Duke Athlon and Onager being warm and personal friends, and the Princess Solima and Zulela were bosom companions from childhood. The Duke immediately accepted the invitation, and our party, with several members of the cabinet and distinguished guests, descended the barriers, embarked in barges, rowed across the lake to the opposite side of the cataract, and landed on the rocky platform skirting the precipice, and on which were erected splendid pavilions decorated with gorgeous banners. We were received by Onager, a noble-looking old man of dark azure complexion, and his wife, Thaloba, a lady of refined and highly aristocratic presence, descended from a long line of Nolita princesses, and their daughter, the Princess Luzella, a bewitchingly beautiful young girl of delicate Hyacinthian complexion, brilliant dark eyes, and radiant with smiles and dimples. They were attired in rich costumes somewhat resembling those worn by Oriental princesses of the old Persian and Arabian days of romance. Sulima and Luzella, who were of the same age, threw themselves into each other's arms in the ardent and impulsive Martian mode. "I esteem this visit of your Highness a most distinguished honor," said Onega with a courtly salutation. But we looked for you, my old friend, first amidst the old festival, and were sadly disappointed. Come now, what excuse can you conjure up?" replied the Duke Athalion. The azure-hued Neolitans cannot presume to ascend to the lofty eminence of the gold-hued Arungas, replied Onager with polite deference. If the blue will not come to the yellow, why then the yellow must go to the blue, replied Athalion. And the union will be bright green, and may this natal day of our beloved children be ever green and fresh in our memories, said Thaloba, as she pinned a beautiful emerald-hued floral souvenir on Solima's bosom. The ladies retired to the royal pavilion, and in short time returned. The princess was attired in a dress similar to those of Thaloba and Luzella, but more rich and elegant. A close-fitting jacket resembling burnished silver, amber-tinted skirt embroidered in floral and arabesque designs, a crimson mantle elaborately decorated in pearl and silver, a jaunty turban of gold lace caught in the center with a diamond spray, light blue trousers resembling the old Persian mode, and gold-embroidered slippers. This attire was so thoroughly in keeping with her resplendent beauty as excited our admiration. The stately Onager relaxed his dignity, showered compliments, and with the air of a court gallant drew her near his side. Thaloba took the arm of Athalon. I had the honor to escort the Princess Luzella. Altafora, the doctor, and John paired off with other royal ladies. We entered an immense cavern, hollowed out in the rocks, splendidly decorated and illuminated with many-colored lights. The assembled throngs greeted us with enthusiastic cheers, mingled with strains of music, and we were escorted to our stations. The appointments and decorations of the banquet were even more gorgeous than those of our own festival, in accordance with the rich and oriental fancy of the Neolitans. Congratulatory speeches were made in honor of the occasion, to which Duke Athalion and the suite made appropriate responses. Songs and recitals were given, and toasts and quaffed in brimming goblets circled the board. Along the platform skirting the precipice, crowds of people in gorgeous attire were witnessing all manners of sports and games. There were wrestling, boxing, foot racing, and rowing matches in which the young men displayed their skill, agility, and strength. There were jugglers, mountebanks, and wizards playing tricks and feats of legerdemain that would have confounded our most clever prestidigitators. There were exhibits and shows of all kinds, giants enormously fat and heavy folk, monstrosities from sea and land, waxworks and puppet shows, such as would make our terrestrial juveniles weep for joy. There were trained animals, birds, reptiles, fish, and insects, performing the most wonderful feats. There were burlesque military displays, masquerades, and fantastic dances. Such a carnival of fun, frolic, and merrymaking never was seen, and the Nalatas entered into it heart and soul. It was now the hour for departure. We bade adieu to our Nalatan friends and passed to the platform. Several of Thaloba's maids of honor brought from the royal pavilion a magnificent casket and coffer containing articles of feminine apparel and ornaments, the sight of which would have been the proudest terrestrial princess and devotees of fashion perfectly crazy with astonishment and delight. "Dearest Solima," said the Duchess, accept these birthday gifts as mementos of this joyful time, and as an earnest of our love and esteem. Within the coffers are dresses especially designed for you by the most skilled artistes of our kingdom. Do me the honor to wear the one designated for the ball this evening, where we shall meet again. Within the casket are jewels, family heirlooms, formerly worn on those occasions by the princesses of my race. For my sake, wear them tonight, selecting from them what you deem appropriate for the occasion." The boats now drew up, and we embarked. The princess with Luzella, who was to spend the remainder of the day with her. Altafora and I occupied one barge. Duke Athalion and suite, the doctor and John, occupied the other. We rowed rapidly over the lake, and our barge, which was in advance, having arrived nearly the opposite cataract, the princess requested the oarsmen to approach nearer that we might obtain a fuller view. We drew so near, the spray fell over us in the showers, and the barge paused in its course, rocking on the billows.